So some of the issues that you guys have talked about so far and things that you've mentioned, which leads me to my next question, which is, if you're elected, going into the next legislature, what are your top 3 legislative priorities going into the next session? Matt, we'll start with you.
Couple things. One is, of course, we need to tackle the issue of illegal immigration because our federal government is falling short. That's a federal responsibility. But we've got 2,000 miles of our border the federal government is failing to protect. So Texas has been spending in excess of $100 million protecting our border, and we need to continue that. And there's some areas that we need to expand with respect to the Ranger Recon team that was established several years ago, and expanding their capabilities. They volunteer with they work with a lot of volunteer patrols, and that's something that we could look forward to and expanding as well as camera surveillance and other surveillance technologies on our border. That's something that the state shouldn't have to step into, but we need to, and that needs to be a priority. In education, we need to look at more local control. I've talked to most of the members of our ISD, and you'd be amazed at how much of the unfunded mandates that come, even from Austin. We talk about unfunded mandates from Washington, but Austin has a lot of unfunded mandates on our education system. And a lot of the trustees in our ISDs have the desire to be able to control the calendar more, teacher pay, ratios, student-to-teacher ratios, those types of things. So a lot more control as far as that. And then one innovative thing that we've done in Collin County is with respect to indigent health care. All the counties are mandated by the state of Texas to provide indigent health care. And what we've done something quite unique with respect to leveraging the private sector healthcare industry in Collin County. And we've totally revamped the way we do that. And I think this is the conservative way to address Obamacare. Not only do we need to push back and stop on Medicaid expansion and stop Obamacare from coming into the state of Texas, but we have a unique, innovative way to tackle health care for the needy that we've implemented in Collin County, and I want to help take that statewide.
Okay, terrific. Now, Glenn, you're next up to respond to that. What would your top 3 priorities be?
Well, as I've already mentioned, I think infrastructure issues must be close to the top of the list. We've been under stage 3 drought restrictions for most of the last 3 or 4 years. If you saw the article in the Dallas Morning News just a week ago Sunday, Lake Levon is at less than 50% of its level. It's lower today than it was this time last year. If we don't get some significant rain, we're going to be under a watering ban come this summer. And so that impacts not only the quality of life we enjoy now, but the ability to continue to grow and develop as an area. Transportation infrastructure is right up there as a priority. We are choking on our own congestion. We're very blessed to live in a dynamic, growing area, but as new people move to the area, we do not have enough money currently to maintain the roads that we have, much less build new infrastructure. So smart, effective management of our resources and stopping diversions out of our transportation fund will help solve those issues. The proposition coming up next November on the ballot is $1 billion, which is a good start, but just a start in order to solve the issues. The Proposition 6 that passed last November is an important start in dedicating $2 billion of funds towards water infrastructure, which is just desperately needed for our area. Education is another area that has already been discussed. Plano has been blessed to have a very strong public education system, and it needs to remain so. We need to not let the courts decide how education gets funded. That must be the responsibility of the legislature. Lastly, limited accountable government. Our government needs to run efficiently. It needs to adopt best practices. All of our businesses have been faced in the last number of years with the task of doing more with less. We need to make sure our government functions in the same way. We cannot have inefficiency and hope to have the results we need in our government.
Thank you. Stacy, what would your top 3 priorities be?
My first priority would be to nullify Obamacare. Really stand up for states' rights. I've spoken with a lot of residents in the district, and that seems to be one of their top priorities, is that they don't like the fact that they're, one, either forced to purchase something that they don't want to purchase, or second, that the fact that with the passage of Obamacare, that their costs are increasing and they're being covered for things that they don't necessarily need. And so that would definitely be the first one. We definitely need to stand strong at the state and to practice our 10th Amendment rights. The second one would be to focus on education. Education has become very centralized with its planning, And that's not serving our students. That's not serving our teachers who are trying to serve our students, and parents aren't very happy with what's going on either. I think the way that we're trying to go about it really is to throw more money at it. Say, oh, we need to fund education because it's for the kids, it's for the students. But more funding isn't necessarily resulting in better education, in resulting in students who come out of school with critical thinking skills, with skills ready for the workforce. And so we really need to localize the control of it, allow teachers who are actually in the classrooms with the students the ability to work with their students because they know them best. Allow parents who are actually in the community sending their children to these institutions to have a say in what their children are learning and to actually be able to see, you know, the results that they're hoping for by sending their children there. And then the last thing that I really want to address is the Second Amendment rights. I'm really a proud supporter of the Second Amendment, and I really want constitutional carry passed in Texas. It's surprising that Texas, you know, being one of the reddest states, is actually not, you know, leading the way in this fight. And I definitely think we need to because, you know, we have a right to protect ourselves, and, you know, I don't think that's something that we should, you know, throw away. So those are my 3 issues. Thank you.
Thank you. And I will tell you that based on your top 3 legislative priorities for all of you, we have more questions that are going to tackle this topic. So believe that. So let's move on to topic number 4, which is the budget. I vowed when I put these questions together, I would just make them open-ended and not leading at all. So I'm just going to pitch it out there. And Glenn, this is for you first. What did you think of the last legislature's budget? And what, if anything, would you have done differently? Or would you do differently? Let's put it that way. Kind of if you're king, so to speak. But please address what they did in the legislature with the budget.
Well, fortunately, in the state of Texas, by our Constitution, we are required to have a balanced budget. And just like our family lives within its means, our state is required to do that as well. We're also fortunate that we have a pretty dynamic and expanding economy that has allowed us, and smartly so, to put away funds in a rainy day fund to use for unexpected expenses, and that's kind of what our family does too. So I was glad to see that the legislature was able to come together, was able to address some priority issues in the budget, was able to restore some of the funding that had been cut out of public education, which was needed to make sure that we're maintaining the quality of education. I agree that money is not always the answer. I think our school districts have to also adopt those types of best practices that businesses adopt to make sure that they're all operating as efficiently, not only in our region, but across our state. So I was glad for those things. I was very pleased to see the legislature move to put Proposition 6 on the ballot, and the voters overwhelmingly passed the Proposition 6, which was the water funding, the $2 billion funding that I mentioned earlier, because that is such a critical need. Otherwise, as it relates to budgeting going forward, what I mentioned earlier, I think, is still very much the case. We need to look at all areas of our government and how it's operated to make sure it's operating efficiently, make sure that technology is being used to get the most results with the least amount of money. I noticed just recently when we're filing our campaign finance reports, we have a technology system that allows them to do this electronically, but it's using technology that was probably written at least 20 years ago. To say that it's not user-friendly is a huge understatement. If I see that as it relates to candidates running for office, I can only imagine how many other individuals, taxpayers, and businesses are faced with the same type of frustration when they're trying to interact with our government, and trying to eliminate that kind of waste and inefficiency is very important.
Okay, Stacy, you're next up. What did you think of the legislature's job with the budget?
So I understand the state legislature has a very difficult job in figuring out where all the funding goes. What I was not a fan of was the increase in the budget. I think that there is, you know, a lot of issues need to be funded and a lot of areas need to be funded. But what we need to focus on, instead of increasing the budget for all of these areas, is to cut the budget in areas that it's not necessary. So we have a lot of state-run departments and agencies that, you know, are outdated and probably need to be addressed. And, you know, if it's not necessary, we should take a look at that. And if they're, you know, not necessary, we can actually get rid of that and save that money from, you know, that specific agency or administration and spend it elsewhere where, you know, we feel that it needs to be spent. In regards to tapping into the rainy day fund for water, I believe that we do have enough funding, within our budget to pay for water, and I don't feel that we actually needed to tap into the rainy day fund for it. I think that really needs to be saved for specific statewide emergencies, and, we are slowly going in that direction, but we haven't gotten to that point yet, is what I believe. So, really it is a difficult job. It is important to keep a balanced budget. All of us individually are able, hopefully, to do that at, in our individual lives, but, that's pretty much how I thought about the state. Thank you.
You bet. Thank you. Okay, Mr. Shaheen?
I was disappointed in the budget process. What was set out by the Speaker of the House was, he said, was water, transportation, and education were the priorities of the legislative session, and only one of those got funded during the regular session. So it's either a priority or it's not a priority. Texas gets X amount of dollars. We have $200 billion biennial that we receive. Half of that, by the way, is from the federal government, which is pretty concerning. Nevertheless, that's the dollars that we have to work with. And what we ended up doing is having to go into special session after special session to get these items funded. And that's not the way it should work. What we need to do is, what are our priorities? We fund those first. I would add criminal justice to the three that I already mentioned. And then the dollars that are left over are what are allocated. I mean, how we funded $24 million for Hollywood to make movies in the state of Texas before we funded education is beyond me. So I guess I have a little bit more to learn on how the legislative session works. But what we need to do is find out what our priorities are, fund those, and then what the dollars are that are left over, we make those decisions, and that's the approach.
Okay, great.
Senator, could I have a moment just to respond to Stacy's answer regarding the Proposition 6 use of funds out of the rainy day fund?
Well, I tell you what I will do. I'm going to ask everybody a follow-up question, and you have 1 minute for that, so squeeze it into that. And here's my follow-up question. So here's my follow-up question to each one of you, starting with Glenn. Do you favor zero-balanced budgeting?
Absolutely.
Zero-based budgeting.
Yes, it's something that I implemented in our firm when I've been running the firm over the last 8 years. I believe that the worst thing you can do is get a bureaucracy, a budget, and say, now how much do you want to grow that budget? They should have to come back each cycle and justify why they're spending those dollars and how they're being spent. So I do think zero-based budgeting is an important tool that must be used at the state level. With respect to the $2 million used in the rainy day fund, that is a revolving fund. It's providing very valuable water infrastructure without which the cost to our economy would be devastating. If you think about the fact that you choke off new businesses and you have such an impact to quality of life, the inability to access those funds, which are taxpayer funds, is simply not advisable. I think those rainy day funds, even though ironically named, certainly should be used for something as critical as water supply.
Okay. Stacy, same question to you. Do you favor zero-based budgeting?
Yes, I do favor zero-based budgeting. A lot of, similar things that Glenn said, I completely agree with. If there's agencies that are, coming for budgeting, they need to be able to say how much they need, why they need it, and be able to show that that's where it's being spent. In response to the water budgeting for Prop 6, I believe that there are other ways that we could have addressed the water issue other than, by spending more out of our rainy day fund. I think one of the options that wasn't quite considered was the idea of dredging the lakes and the aquifers that we have for the sediment at the bottom, because a lot of our lakes, they're not actually being used to its full capacity. So by creating more, eventually it's still going to be, as rain falls, as sediment goes into it, the capacity of the water that can retain is still going to continue to decrease. So by creating more, you're just kind of pushing it down, like the same issue down the line.
That's a good point. They do that at White Rock Lake all the time.
And
it gets filled up. Okay, so Matt, same question, zero-based budgeting.
Yeah, I mean, zero-based budgeting is, it's a no-brainer. It's what the private sector does. You don't automatically grow budgets. That just doesn't make sense. But we really need to go beyond that. I mean, one of the things that we did at Collin County is we required return on investments for the taxpayer dollars that were invested in certain projects. And we really need to go beyond zero-based budgeting. That should be the starting point. We really need to say, go to the citizens and say, we've spent X amount of dollars. Here's the return on investment that you're getting for that money. And that's not done today. And that's why when you look at the state budget, you see a lot of silliness or lack of efficiencies. For example, the state of Texas has multiple IT departments, has multiple purchasing departments, and all those should be centralized. You know, Austin wants to centralize all their power down in Austin, but when it comes to their own shit, they want to have multiple departments. But, you know, it's those types of things that we really need to look at. So beyond zero-based budgeting, that's pretty much a no-brainer. Let's require return on investment for our taxpayer dollars.
That's a good point. That's a good point. Okay, next subject, Stacy. I'm glad you are getting this question first. You seem very tuned into this, which is in limiting state government. Can you name 3 state departments that you would eliminate?
The first state department I would like to eliminate is the North Texas Tollway Association. You know, I'm not a fan of public and private partnerships, so you know, that's definitely one of them I would like to get rid of. The second one, it's not exactly, I guess, a state one, but the the Transportation Security Administration that we are, you know, that we do have to have in the state of Texas because of federal reasons. And there's the last one. There is actually, it's pretty interesting because of, there's a whole entire list whenever I was looking up of all of the agencies that, you know, Texas funds publicly. And there was one of them whenever I was looking it up a while ago, which was the Emancipation Juneteenth Association or something. And when I had first looked it up about maybe a month ago, it had shown that this organization was still being funded. And then only recently when I went back to look at it, did it say that it was actually dissolved back in 2011. So obviously whoever is updating this is not doing their job correctly. So perhaps maybe we need to dissolve that group as well, and maybe, you know, allow you know, a privatized company who knows how to update their website to run it instead. So those would be my 3.
Okay, great. All right, Matt, what are your ideas? What departments or agencies would you cut?
I got a couple dozen. This is one of them, I'm limited to 3. Yeah, I referred to it earlier. I mean, there are multiple overhead departments in the state. Those can be consolidated. I mean, it would save millions of dollars from an IT perspective. You got literally different purchasing departments that have different IT systems. I mean, it's just ridiculous. So literally, when you look across the state, there's literally dozens. I think we're thinking, you know, Health and Human Services or those types of things. And I would look at it a little bit differently. What I would do is, as part of the sunset process that the state has established today, what type of consolidation efforts, opportunities rather, are there within the process? I would make that part of it. And I'm not joking. There are literally dozens of departments within the state budget that can be reduced or taken out, right?
Okay. Glenn?
Matt mentioned the sunset review process that we have. That's a set process that our state has to systematically go by each department and commission on a regular basis and look at what they do, how they do it, and whether or not they should be renewed. And I get the feeling that bureaucracies, being bureaucracies, which typically are all about perpetuating themselves, that process has not been nearly as rigorous as it needs to be in eliminating the waste and making sure those agencies and departments are running as efficiently as they should. A perfect example, and one that I think deserves a great deal of scrutiny, is TxDOT, Texas Department of Transportation. I mean, transportation is a huge issue, and we can't eliminate that department, but we need to make sure that it is operating in a way that's both effective and efficient in addressing the needs of the citizens of Texas. I don't know about you, but when I'm on Texas highways, I don't always get the sense that that's the case, and so that's an area where I think needs some immediate scrutiny. Licensing and regulation. I was out walking neighborhoods just last weekend and came across a small businessman who's in the pool repair business, and he was talking about how just recently Texas has decided to regulate pool repairs, and it was killing his business, because what was happening is there were these bureaucrats in Austin out of touch with the way this really happens, and they were putting these large fees and expenses and unreasonable regulations on the way he was operating his business, and it was pushing him out of business. And I think that's what happens so often when you have governmental regulation that's out of touch as to what happens really in our communities. And lastly, the one that just always confuses me is the Railroad Commission. They regulate our energy, but one, I think they are going to finally get the name updated so it actually relates to what they do. But again, here's an area where we need to make sure that the state agencies and commissions are actually addressing the issues that impact the citizens and the businesses.
Terrific, thank you. Okay, so now, Matt, you're going to start on this next one. So our next topic is taxation. And kind of broadly, within the state of Texas, what would be your preferred system of taxation? Or I guess maybe in another way, based on what we have now, what would you like to see revised? What would be a more fair means of taxation within the states, within the state? And then the second question to that would be, would you take a pledge to not raise taxes?
I've already taken that pledge. As far as the taxation, if you look at the biennial revenues for the state of Texas, it's about $208 billion. And I was alluding to earlier, about $96 billion of that is taxes. I mean, one change that we need to make right now is get rid of the margins tax. That was passed in a special session. I really challenge the validity of whether that's constitutional or not in Texas. At a minimum, it's against the spirit of the Texas Constitution. But we could phase that out. It only represents about $2.6 billion of revenues for the state of Texas, so it's actually not that much. It's about 3% of our revenues. So I would phase that out. That would be a big change that I would propose.
Okay, great, all right. Glenn, you are next up to tackle that issue of taxation.
But I think Texas's system of taxation is overly complicated and not always fair and equitable in the way that it's applied. I think I agree with Matt that the Texas franchise tax, also known as the margin tax, has been a big mess. It came out of the 2006 special session trying to deal with, once again, a lawsuit to come up with a better way to fund public education. And I heard several folks refer to it as an idea that was half-baked. And it seems like as it's been implemented and how sort of unfair and unequally it's applied across businesses, that's absolutely the case. I've actually been down in Austin last several sessions trying to work with members to address inequalities that are baked into the Texas franchise tax, and eliminating it would be, probably a good solution. As for the tax pledge, my position is that if you can eliminate taxes or reform the tax system that allows us to have a fairer, broader-based system that still would allow the state to meet its revenue needs, because there are needs, because I do believe that limited government is not the same as no government, and things like public safety, like transportation, like education, are areas where the state does need to provide revenue. You need to understand the best and most fair way to raise those revenues. And so by taking a pledge that says, I will not raise taxes before I know all the facts and the circumstances that might cause some tax to increase, but 3 other taxes to be eliminated or go away, is an unwise thing for somebody who's in a governing role to do. So I would not sign such a pledge.
Okay. Stacy, taxation, would you take a pledge?
Yes, I've also already taken that pledge that I would not vote to increase taxes. As to answer the question on taxation, I definitely agree that we need to get rid of the franchise and margins tax with both of them. And the other tax I'd actually like to get rid of is the property tax. A lot of people, if you have a right to your life, liberty, and property, then why in the world are you still renting your land and your property from the government? So that's how I feel about the property tax. I'm very glad that Texas does not have an income tax. I am a teaching assistant, so my salary is not very high, so I'm extremely glad that we don't have a Texas income tax. And, for me, I think the fair way of raising funds for state use would be the consumption tax. I think that way, across the board, as long as you're purchasing something, you're part of that purchase is going to fund state requirements and state needs. Thank you.
Great. No, that's good. And you mentioning the property tax, that was one of my follow-up questions, was about property taxes. And I know we've seen different referendums, different things on the ballots to eliminate taxes for veterans, eliminate property taxes for disabled people, eliminate property. And I guess now, that list is growing. So again, back to being fair and balanced. And Stacy, to your point about renting your property from the government, so my follow-up question was, what's your view on that? And I guess we're going back to Matt to start that, on eliminating the property tax so that you actually have ownership.
Yeah, it sounds great. The problem is if you go to counties where the assumption is you would replace the property tax with the sales tax. The challenge you have is the math doesn't really work well for smaller counties, so they don't have a really big retail base. So what happens is you have insufficient funding for your criminal justice systems, your schools, those types of things. So it sounds like a great idea to abolish the property tax and go to the sales tax. Problem is the numbers just don't work, and what you'll end up doing is introducing something like we have with Robin Hood, where then the state's going to get in and start collecting everybody's revenues, and we're going to redistribute them, and that's going to be a mess. People that are part of the Plano ISD know that we've lost over $1 billion in recapture. So what I would recommend is, with the property tax, I think we need to pressure our local elected officials to spend wisely and lower their taxes. Let's all of us lean on the county commissioners or the ISDs or the city councils. If we want property tax relief, let's lean on those local governing bodies and get tax reliefs that way. Having Austin cut other people's taxes and then getting the credit, I'm not sure that's the wisest thing to do either. But so anyway, that's my
Glenn?
And like Matt, I do agree that while it would be nice to say, oh, we don't have to pay property taxes anymore, it's simply not a workable solution. You can imagine without having property taxes, sales taxes on items could be as much as 30%. So not only does that math not work for areas that don't have a strong sales tax base, it would significantly impact consumption, retailers, and those who produce those goods and services in our state. And so I think there's a real problem in just saying, well, let's just get rid of the property tax because it's not a workable or a feasible solution. But thinking broad-mindedly about how can we make sure we have a fair and broad-based system that allows individuals to pay the least amount of tax. I mean, we're so fortunate in Texas not to have a state income tax, and it should always and must always remain that way, and I'm absolutely committed to that. That's one pledge that I would take, that we should never have any kind of state income tax on individual or corporate level. And the franchise tax really is essentially a disguised income tax for corporations.
I'm going to take a point of privilege. I'm going to needle you guys one more time on this property tax thing. How about allowing the property tax to be eliminated once you pay off your underlying mortgage or lien on the property? Would you phase out property tax for someone in that situation once they paid off their property? And then at a later point in time, if the property is sold to another buyer, that you could reinstitute property taxes on the property?
What's the rules? Do I start?
10 second follow-up here. This is a quick hit question.
10 seconds?
Well, just something, just quick. What do you think about
Thank you
that?
very well.
Conceptually.
I'm open to anything conceptual. I'd have to really see what the numbers are. At the end of the day, I'm for as much tax relief as humanly possible, and I've got the record to stand up on that. But at the end of the day, we do have a criminal justice system to run. We have law enforcement to provide. We have jails to put the bad guys in, and city council with its sewage and so forth. So, I'd have to look at the numbers.
Okay,
So it sounds like a great idea. But
I got it. Okay, Glenn, what do you think?
My thought on that is I'm not sure how it would work from the commercial perspective. Because, as much as all of us as homeowners would like to say, as soon as I get my home paid off, I don't have to pay taxes anymore, I can see commercial property owners who I work with on a daily basis saying, oh, well, let's just disguise our debt as equity.
That's a good
so
point.
That we don't
I meant primarily for residential, for residents.
But we have a cost, and a problem if you split the tax roll. You can't really split the tax roll between residential and commercial because then you start shifting that burden, and all of a sudden you're saying, oh, we're doing this great favor for homeowners, but as you're shifting that burden to commercial owners, then you start impacting jobs and economic development.
Isn't the burden already shifted to property owners now?
To commercial property owners.
Well, anyway, okay. All right, okay, good enough. Let's move on. All right, so now.
Stacy.
Oh, no, I assume that you're all for that. That should be an emphatic yes.
I do just want to clarify, though, some people might assume that I'm just for suddenly getting rid of it altogether at one point in time. I obviously understand that it is something that needs to be phased out. It's not, most change doesn't come overnight, and if it does, everybody freaks out. So it's definitely something that needs to be phased out, but definitely I am an emphatic yes on that.
Yes, ma'am.
So, yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so now.